As we continue our discussion about the ongoing conflict in Iraq, joining me now is Manal Omar. She is the acting vice president at the Center for the Middle East and Africa at the United States Institute of Peace. She's lived in Baghdad, and welcome again to the show.
Thank you for having me.
As our previous two guests told us, the conflict in northwestern Iraq is now not just a regional conflict, it's rapidly becoming an international conflict. So given that, should there be an international response to this? And if there should be one, what kind of form should that international response take?
I think that we're definitely at the point where there needs to be an international response. I mean, what we've seen emerge from Iraq and from Syria is truly a threat to everyone across the globe. I think what's very important is that we're not looking at it just from a military lens. There needs to be an intervention that includes a political solution, hopefully one that is run from people and leaders in the countries as well as from the region. That should be the people taking the lead, but with international support to really make sure that whatever agreement is made, particularly any political solution, is actually enforced.
All right, talking about a political solution, there's a new man who's been asked to form a government right now in Iraq, Haider al-Abadi. Are you optimistic that he will be able to form a government that might stabilize the political situation somewhat, diffuse tensions, bring in the Sunnis?
I'm cautiously optimistic in the sense that at least you have a new figure. The fact that you have a new figure is making people a little bit more cooperative. I do have concerns that I think most of the international community has over-personalized the role of Maliki. The challenges that exist under Maliki, particularly the Sunni leadership and bringing them into the new government, as well as the security situation, are far beyond one person. It really will take both Iraqi leaders coming together, but as well as international support. So again, cautiously optimistic. I think it was the right move, but there still needs to be a lot of strength behind any decisions that are made to really push for an inclusive, unified Iraqi government.
And if that is the goal, an inclusive, unified Iraqi government, at the same time, do you want to see international forces get involved in the military conflict, which is in the northwest of the country?
I think that there's going to need some support. What's happening and what we're seeing emerge is something beyond the Iraqi government. I think we have to also remember at the height of violence in Iraq, when the whole U.S. Forces were there, it was very difficult to contain the insurgency. And now you have something way beyond what we saw in 2008 or 2006. So there will need to be some international support. Again, my only concern is if we think that we can do military strikes quickly and just leave. Whether in Iraq or Syria, we're in for a heavy lift and we're in for a long haul, and there isn't much of an appetite in America for that type of intervention. So it's a very difficult position for political leaders to be in today.
A long haul, but ultimately, can Islamic State be defeated on the battlefield?
I think that they, can and must. What you're looking at is a threat that is truly something that is frightening. I'm always very cautious to, feed into the rhetoric of fear. But the reality is the Islamic State is a threat that we haven't seen before. At the current time, they're very prepared to take advantage of the vacuums of power that exist in the region. A few years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I wouldn't have been as concerned about the emergence of the Islamic State. It's just all that perfect storm elements of a lack of leadership from Iraq, a lack of unity. You have Syria, you have a border that's pretty much disappeared. The conflicts have merged. It really is a recipe that the Islamic State has been able to exploit and take advantage of that needs to be defeated quickly.
Right. I asked our other guests the same question. Is it going to require American forces on the ground?
I think that it will require some type of U.S. intervention that includes at least experts that are advising the Iraqi military and, hopefully the Syria opposition, and that will need to be in close proximity. What that looks like, I'm not a military expert, but I think quick airstrikes or drones or attacks are going to be something that is just not enough to defeat what we're seeing.
Right, and when we see how these groups that are fighting Islamic State are being armed and financed. You've got the Peshmergas on one side, you've got militias, you've got the Iraqi National Army. They're disparate groups. I mean, is that ultimately going to lead to the partition of Iraq?
I think that that's a very good question. In terms of the partition of Iraq, it's something that's been discussed over the last 10 years. I think it's a very difficult conversation to have in terms of what we understand partition to be. I think if you look at the Iraqi constitution, there is flexibility for some type of federal independency of autonomous regions. I think that there is a dialogue and conversation that can take well within the rule of law of the Iraqi constitution that would provide for freedom, both in terms of budget implementation as well as military protection. protection as a regional autonomous. So I'd like to see more conversations around that gives basically what people are asking for without having to use the terms of separation or partition, and that already exists in the Iraqi constitution.
Yeah, because the added complication, of course, is that different parts of Iraq have some of the country's major resources, like oil.
That's correct, and that's exactly why the constitution left that flexibility, so that you still partition, you have autonomy, but you share through a centralized budget distribution. And I think that there are real mechanisms that can be put in place, but again, you would need international support and observation to make sure whatever's agreed on is enforced, because what we've seen in the past, and this is particularly after the last election, not the recent one, the one before, is that agreements were made that were actually very viable, pragmatic solutions, but were never implemented. So there needs to be some type of enforcement if there is going to be that conversation about regional autonomous states.
Right, getting back to what's happening on the battlefield, we now have the New York Times reporting that there is this very unlikely coalition of militias backed by Iran, supported by US airstrikes, taking on Islamic State. And what do you make of that? This is the most unlikely coalition.
Yeah, it is indeed an unlikely coalition, and I think that's one of the things that we've been expecting, is that you're going to see people who have generally not necessarily worked together come together because of this new threat. And I think that in some elements that will be a very positive way of fighting ISIS. I think that we just have to be very careful in really weighing the long-term consequences of these alliances, making sure that, you know, in correcting this unbalance of power, which ISIS has definitely come out and again fulfilled the vacuum, we're not creating a new one. And the international community has been known to do that, solve one problem by creating three more. And I think that it has to be very careful as we're looking at it, and it's why the political solution, the military gains are not enough. We really need to be emphasizing the political solutions. We need to be watching, supporting, pressuring, whatever the right way of El Abedi when he announces the new government. Pay attention. Is it going to be all the ministries? Who's the Ministry of Defense? Who's the Ministry of Interior? Remembering Maliki's mistakes weren't him as an individual, but was the political climate of Iraq. And so as we see these alliances, I think it makes a lot of sense in the short term. But we need to be weighing and mitigating the risks long term, and I think that's through a political solution.
Right, and the United States has a big role to play. Yeah, it is playing a big role right now, but we don't see any kind of broad US strategy to resolve this in the long term. What is this going to look like maybe 10 years from now, anything like that? I mean, just an example here, as I just mentioned, the United States and militias backed by Iran are now basically fighting together against Islamic State. At the same time, Washington announces sanctions against Tehran. I mean, talk about mixed messages.
I think that there is a lot of potential with the talks, I mean, in terms of looking at Iran and understanding the role of Iran in the region long term. I think that there is an understanding of that in this administration, that there is a realization that if you want a stable region in 10 years, in 15 years, that Iran has to be a player, whether it's, you know, positive is what everyone is hoping for. If it's negative, trying to figure out how to balance out that power. I do think, though, in terms of Iraq long-term strategy, that there are a lot of conversations and there are a lot of discussions that are looking towards helping Iraq become a strong nation, secure its borders, and have a military that can really provide protection in terms of both its own borders, but also in terms of the region. And you're seeing more cooperation among the regional players because of the threat of Islamic State. I mean, keep in mind, for a long time, Saudi Arabia, other countries were isolating at best, if not very hostile towards Iraq, and that has begun to shift with the recognition of the threat of the Islamic State.
And just getting back to the Iranian involvement in this, Islamic State wants to create this caliphate, as they call it, this Islamic State, which will run across, straddles borders. Does it also pose a threat to Iran?
Oh, most definitely it poses a threat to Iran. I mean, one of the biggest rhetorics is against both the Western powers and particularly a focus on the U.S., but of course, they're trying to use the rhetoric of sectarianism and create or further enhance a Sunni-Shia divide, which, you know, I always emphasize was not there prior to 2003. I mean, this divide has really been exacerbated by the political, by the economic situations, and, you know, just as they're taking advantage of the vacuum of power, they're taking advantage of the sectarian rhetoric, and of course, this then targets Iran and feeds into a fear of a larger regional divide between Sunni and Shia. And, you know, that will slowly pour into countries like Bahrain. It will have effects in countries like Yemen. It will have direct effect on the Gulf. And so, you know, this really, really frightens the regional players.
Manal Omar, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.